Look, there's nothing airy-fairy about compassion. Compassion can get people killed, and does, all over the world. You know, where hatred rules, where people have a vested interest in building barriers between people, and you want to break down those barriers, you're going to run into big trouble in South Africa. Those of us who try to penetrate the apartheid barrier found just how viciously it was defended by people who had a vested interest in that kind of alienated living. The other thing I think we've got to get away from is that compassion is some kind of notion. It's actually a practiced way of life, And I think we've got to get away from the idea that what you believe is your faith. Your faith only matters when you live it out. And why I like the Compassion Charter is because I'm a preacher. I know the power of words. Words can be used to sway people. Words influence people. I think on the airwaves in this society, there are words of hate being spewed out every day, which I think could very well be expressed in action at some point. Words don't lie. They're never neutral. They end up in behavior. And so we're countering that with the Charter of Compassion. And we're actually calling people back to being truly human. We're calling people back from the belief that you have to behave in some kind of narrow religious or ethnic or tribal way in order to have an identity. We're saying, rejoin the human race. Become a compassionate person and you've become a human being. And that's the most wonderful race to belong to. I mean, that is the human race. And that means the difference between life and death on this planet. I think these words have power. I think as I looked around the room and looked at people of different faiths, Muslims, Christians, Hindus, Jews, Buddhists from all over the world, I had a profound sense of privilege of being in that room, but I also just, all sorts of things sort of flashed across my mind, whether it was Burma, whether it was the Middle East, whether it was South Africa and its apartheid, whether it was Iraq and Iran, whether it was all these wars, and I thought, how much has what we have said about what we believe contributed to that? And the question came back to me, how many people have died because of the way I practice what I believe or express what I believe? I think that's a legitimate question that every major religion has to grapple with. And so the first thought that came to me about the Charter is that whatever else we said about compassion, we would have to confess that every major religion has failed at one or other or many times in history to live compassionately and to teach compassion. And that we needed to acknowledge that. Nobody out there will believe a word we say unless the first thing we do is to acknowledge that we are deeply at fault in many ways. Apartheid was put in place in the name of Christianity. There was a bunch of Christians in South Africa who vigorously taught that this was the way human beings should live. And there was nothing wrong with it. Now, I also lived through the amazing moment and was present when a representative of that group of Christians in South Africa stood up and confessed that he and his people and his church had been deeply implicated and responsible in the hurts and the oppression and the horrors of apartheid, and asked forgiveness. And I also lived through the moment when a little black bishop came bouncing up onto the stage. We all know who he was, Desmond Tutu, and said to the rest of us, who were not quite as inclined as we might have been to be compassionate in that moment, and said, well, I don't know about the rest of you, but my faith teaches me that when somebody confesses, I've got to forgive. So let's work on the issue of forgiveness now. And I think that moment, which is not well known, I think actually sowed the seeds for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission later. It created the climate in which that could happen. So I have seen what happens when people can get over the barriers that have been built into their lives by ideology, by political indoctrination, by very often religious dogmatism and prejudice. And when they can somehow get over that, life comes instead of death. And that is why I was deeply touched by one of my black colleagues who we were talking about whether we should reach out to the people who had espoused this apartheid ideology in South Africa. And he was a black guy. And he said, look, what is the point of talking to anybody else? You know, reconciliation and compassion and human living is about reaching out to the enemy. And somebody, a theologian in this country, in the United States, a chap by the name of Walter Wink, goes even further. He makes a very radical claim. He says the way to God today, there's only one way to God today, and that's through the enemy. That's whatever it was last century or the century before. Today, the only way to God is through the enemy. Unless you can find the courage and the grace to engage your enemy, your faith really has no power at all, no meaning at all, because that's what's tearing up the world. You know, people are enemies. People seem to see the other as enemy. We seem to be born with the need to have somebody out so that we can feel we're in. If we lose one enemy, we manufacture a new one immediately because we can't live without the enemy. So he was saying that's the way through to if you like, the healing of the planet, you know. And I think there's a lot of truth in that.